are joined today by Thomas de Waal, Caucasus expert for the Carnegie Endowment. Good morning, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning, glad to be here.
Okay, so in 2003, the book was published, Black Garden, taking an analytical look, if you will, at Karabakh. Since that, really not all that much has changed. So you are getting ready to write a final chapter, or another chapter.
Another chapter, yeah. There may be many chapters, yeah.
Sure. What will be different in that chapter? What's changed?
Unfortunately not. I think we're still, everyone, I mean, obviously a lot has happened, even more so in Azerbaijan than Armenia in the last 10 years, domestically, and lots happened in Georgia, and stuff has happened in Armenia too. But that's domestic situation. If you look at the region as a whole, borders are still closed, and the biggest problem remains the Karabakh conflict. Everyone is still, in a sense, prisoners of the Karabakh conflict, and again, there have been the moments. I was watching Key West 2001, Kazan 2011 was another of those moments. It looks like it might get done. Everyone pulls back. We're in the same situation.
Was Kazan 2011 disappointing for you?
It was, in a sense. What you're always looking for is someone who wants to see this conflict resolved. On a fair and just basis in which both sides get most of what they want. Which is possible, is a game changer. And when you see the president of Russia making such a big push, when you see President Obama making a telephone call, obviously you're wary because you've seen this movie before, but you think, well, this time it could be different. Unfortunately, it wasn't.
Yeah, really nothing. No, unfortunately, I've spent the beginning of this interview more or less asking you about nothing because not much has changed. Here's one more. In 2009, you wrote a paper called The Karabakh Trap. In some ways criticized mostly on the Armenian side, but I do want to read one excerpt. You wrote, "To conclude with, I would like to say that there is not any real military solution of the conflict for Azerbaijan, and that the military aggression may lead to a catastrophe for the country." Still the same?
Absolutely, if anything, even more so. I think the Azerbaijani idea, if you like, I was there in the summer, is we're a lot richer, we're a lot stronger, we're now spending more on the military than Armenia spends on its entire state budget, and that we will be like Reagan bankrupted the Soviet Union, we will bankrupt Armenia with an arms race. They're not talking about war, but they're talking about an arms race that will bankrupt Armenia and force them to make more concessions. I think that's a bit of an illusion. I think obviously it will be a problem for Armenia economically, that scenario. But basically, as you build up more weapons, you end up with mutually assured destruction. I mean, it will certainly be very, very costly for Armenians if Azerbaijan were to try something, but it would be horrible for Azerbaijan as well. It would be a much more catastrophic and destructive war than the one we saw in the 90s, and that was bad enough.
Sure. As you know, comments such as the one I read and other comments that you make frustrate the Armenian side from time to time. What do you take of the criticism?
I think it's normal. I think both sides live in their realities. A lot of those realities are kind of politically presented realities, and that's understandable, that there's a feeling that we can't, we have to unify the nation, we can't show any signs of weakness, and therefore when I start suggesting alternative realities, I get criticized. Armenians, I think, are more active readers than Azerbaijanis, which is probably, I think, a major reason why I get more criticism from the Armenian side, because they read every single word I read, whereas Azerbaijan is not such a reading culture. But it's normal. On the other hand, I come back here, every year to Armenia, Azerbaijan, to go to Karabakh quite often. I have a lot of friends. I have a lot of friendly conversations. So, it's not as though I'm a persona non grata. I walk down the street and people recognize me and are friendly to me. So I see on the private side is actually a lot more friendly to me than the public side.
The perception for some is that you're pro-Azerbaijan. I think to ask such a general question about a complex issue is difficult. So I would ask you what you would say to someone who said that to you.
I would say that most people on this region, on this conflict, they have the conclusion, and then they kind of build the evidence that they find around that.
Conclusion first, evidence second.
Yeah, and I'm a British guy with a Dutch name who got interested in this conflict, and I've spent a lot of time on both sides. I've done my best to build up the evidence, and there are some conclusions which the Armenian side don't like. There are some conclusions that the Azerbaijani side don't like, and that's all I would say.
Sure. Let's back out a little bit and talk about the entire region, include Georgia in the discussion. If you're looking at 3 countries, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, state of affairs in 2011, who's ahead, who's behind, kind of break it down if you want.
Well, I mean, you know, everywhere's got their own particular situation. Azerbaijan, obviously, Baku, booming. When I was there in the summer, it's Dubai, everything is floodlit, lots of marble, lots of, you know, children's playgrounds, lots of money around. They're all very pleased about Eurovision, etc. And yet, of course, you know, as we all know, oil and gas doesn't particularly create jobs. It can create a boom and bust mentality. Maybe we're in the boom, and 10 years down the road, there'll be the bust. And I think what people don't really understand here is that Azerbaijan is a kind of vulnerable, insecure country, and that Armenia has definitely done its bit by obviously taking Karabakh, but also the lands around Karabakh, which weren't Armenian, didn't have Armenians in before the war. So that in a sense, Armenians have done their bit to undermine Azerbaijan's sense of security and having a state. Georgia, again, I think a lot more self-confident on the surface than underneath. Some very successful reforms, obviously, in the early Saakashvili period, then the disaster of the war. And now the feeling that really they're a one-party state and the one party doesn't really want to give up power. Maybe because they fear that the people who come after will undo some of the good reforms, but often, you know, for the general reason, the party doesn't want to give up power because they like power and it suits them.
That's not a new storyline.
That's not a new storyline. And Armenia, I think, in a sense, has changed the least. You know, obviously a bit more prosperity in Yerevan. You know, I suppose I noticed more professionalization here in the ministries and so on. But still, you know, many of the same problems people were talking about 10 years ago in terms of rural poverty, immigration. You know, again, this kind of democratic deficit. The same problems people were talking about 10 years ago.
Is the phrase "change the least" another way of saying done the least and potentially falling the furthest behind your neighbors?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think Armenia has certain advantages. There's a certain inherent political stability in Armenia that whoever comes to power, I think, you know, does not rock the status quo as much as they do in Georgia or Azerbaijan. There's obviously, and the diaspora is obviously a stabilizing factor. But yes, I mean, economically, Armenia is probably in the worst shape of all three. And I guess what always is frustrating about Armenia is you see this potential, all those Armenians out there that you meet certainly meet in the US, many of whom would like to come back and work in Armenia, but just don't feel that there's a place for them, or that there's the right job for them or work for them in Armenia. So you just feel that there's a lot of missing potential here. That if you were to reshuffle the cards a lot, Armenia could really have quite an influx of dynamic people who just never quite decide to make it.
Let's kind of take a circular route and tie it all back in and finish with this. Based on what you just said, and economy type stuff, how does that play into whatever resolution may or may not happen in the next year, 10 years, 20 years?
Well, let me also take a step back and say my general, I mean, I also published a book last year, little plug, called The Caucasus, an Introduction, which is about the whole region. And one of the kind of big conclusions I make there is that it's always the tail that wags the dog in this region, that I reject the idea that the great powers sit around deciding what's going to happen in the Caucasus and move pawns on a chessboard. I don't think that's how it works. I think actually local interests start, and then the locals appeal to their kind of big brother allies, you help me on this, and the locals drag in the big powers. And that's definitely what happened, you know, the Karabakh regional Soviet back in 1988 making its decision, obviously with support from other Armenians. That crisis kind of spread outwards from Stepanakert, and now you could say a whole region which includes, Caspian Sea, Georgia, Turkey, Iran to some degree. Everyone's kind of, the future development of this region as a region, everyone's kind of captive. We're all sort of captives of the Karabakh conflict. So increasingly, I think it would be nice if there was some kind of great democratic movement from below, but I don't see that.
Okay.
And absent that, I think some kind of big regional, almost kind of 19th century style conference where everyone's at the table and sit around and say, what's your interest, what's my interest, we've got a general interest here, who can provide what, that may be the only solution to this conflict. But unfortunately, Russia, US, whatever, Turkey, everyone's got bigger fish to fry, bigger crises, and Karabakh is always sort of somewhere down the list.
So it's forgotten.
It's forgotten, or there's a kind of,
We don't forget it.
There's some interest. Medvedev obviously took an interest, but maybe if what that showed was that if one party takes a strong interest and doesn't sufficiently engage, drag in the others, it doesn't work. So maybe it's, the Russians, the Americans, the Europeans, the Turks, the Iranians perhaps, all need to be at the table for this to work.
Thomas de Waal, thank you so much for joining us. I'm not sure if what you told us is great or bad or just reality of what is currently going on, but perhaps in the near future we see a resolution, and we assume that you'll continue to follow it, so thank you.
Yeah, well, I hope to be here on that day.